Hello, it's Friday the 13th of January and this is the UK Column's first weekly news programme. Each Friday we will be reviewing the week's news, providing an insight you won't find on the BBC. The European financial system continued its chaotic descent into hell this week. On Wednesday, officials from the IMF, European Central Bank and EU, collectively known as the Troika, visited Dublin to review its loan programme to Ireland. As part of the visit, Ireland's books were audited to see how the country has performed against the Troika's demands for austerity. They also instructed Ireland's government on the hoops that they will have to jump through in the coming 3 months for continued access to a borrowing rate of 3% provided by the Troika. The bond market will not lend for less than 8%, well above the national unsustainable 7% threshold. Meanwhile, in Italy, unelected dictator Mario Monti has also been facing the reality of borrowing from the markets at a rate above that 7% threshold. Unfortunately for him, the Troika doesn't have pockets deep enough to offer him a similar deal to Ireland. However, there has been some relief for Monti. Italy and Spain each held a bond auction this week, and much to the surprise of commentators, actually managed to sell some. A possible reason for the loosening of the purse strings is the pumping of almost 500 billion euros into the European banks by the European Central Bank just before Christmas. The money was lent to the bank at 1% over 3 years. This was the biggest infusion of hyperinflationary credit by the ECB ever and represents 5% of the GDP of the whole European Union in one day. The move was part of the ECB's package of measures intended to stabilise financial markets. The Association of German Banks said at the time that the cash injection would decisively improve the liquidity of European banks and help ward off potential credit shortages in the Eurozone. The ECB is expected to pump another €500 billion into the banks in February. That Spain has had some success raising money on the markets has not, unfortunately for the Spanish, prevented their Prime Minister from imposing an austerity package which is likely to push Spanish unemployment close to 24% this year. And that's just the official massaged figures. The drive for World War III continues apace, with ever more pre-Iraq style rhetoric from politicians and commentators. This week's highlight came from W. Scott Thompson, former assistant to the Secretary of Defense during the Reagan years, and current Council on Foreign Relations member. Thompson has warned that any attack by Israel on Iran would result in 200 million casualties. The biggest danger hovering over Mother Earth right now, he said, is the apparent determination of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to be the last Israeli Prime Minister. Commentating directly on the likely use of nuclear weapons arising from such an attack, Thompson estimated the worst-case scenario of 200 million casualties from direct hits and spreading radiation. Conservative MP Daniel Korczynski was in competitive mood this morning, crossing intellectual swords with the host of BBC Radio 4's morning news programme on the topic of David Cameron's controversial trip to Saudi Arabia. Quite appropriately, the presenter was keen to point out the appalling human rights record, feudal political and economic system, and asked a number of pointed questions of Mr. Korczynski on these issues, who stood his ground, determined to highlight the importance of our ongoing strategic relationship with the Saudi Kingdom as a key ally in the region, both in terms of trade and geopolitical alliances. Indeed so. Ever since Oxford University graduate and suspected MI6 agent Saudi Prince Bandar generously signed the first of many $15,000 checks to Osama Baznan, who went on to fund and support a number of the 9/11 hijackers, business has never been better for the private military contractor, war, death and destruction industry. For most ordinary people, Saudi Arabia is a backwards, theocratic, medieval dictatorship and, with its clear links to 9/11, perhaps the most evil state on the face of the earth. But for the tallest MP in the House of Commons, perhaps the world looks different, even inverted, from his particular orbital spin position in the world of Anglo-American defence contractors and bilateral trade with autocratic regimes. Interestingly enough, when he isn't busy pimping weapons to fascist dictatorships, Mr. Korczynski doubles up as chair of the Cross-Parliamentary Working Group on Libya. from where he recently made the case that British companies should get first dibs on the spoils of the recent regime change war in that country. He was keen to point out, however, that in these difficult economic times, it would not be unreasonable to expect Libya to pay back some or a portion of the costs of the war to those who stood by her. Whoever said that free markets were free? And finally, Serco, the biggest company you've never heard of, has won the contract with the Ministry of Defence to deploy radar technology to prevent wind farms interfering with the UK's air defence radars. The new contract is worth £27 million. A much better way to prevent wind farms from interfering with the UK's air defence radar would be to knock all the windmills down. The use of 9th century technology to generate small amounts of electricity for only half the time is an energy strategy which can only lead to one result: even more electricity bought from the French, who, despite also destroying their most beautiful landscapes with wind turbines, are still capable of generating electricity in adverse weather conditions, using nuclear and hydropower stations. I have been Malcolm Massey, and this has been the UK Column News.